begin the recording to the cloud, please? Today is Christ the King Sunday. This Sunday is a little sliver inserted between ordinary time, also called the season after Pentecost, and Advent. It's like a little door that moves us from one season, ordinary time, to Advent. You know, this little door here wasn't always here. Before it was put into this little sliver between ordinary time and Advent, it used to just jump from the green season to the blue or purple season. In the green season, it would end with the final judgment. And then it goes straight into Advent. Now, the final judgment we need to pay attention to what it really does. There, it was about the judgment of the nations. In Matthew 25, we hear about the sorting of the goats and sheep, right? And how many of you get kind of nervous, wondering if you're a goat or a sheep? But it's very clear in that sorting that the goats and sheep are the nation of the world. Has that nation cared for the poor? Has that nation cared for the vulnerable? It is about the salvation of nations. After World War I, Pope Pius XI got a little nervous about the rise of secular nationalism. He thought the nations were becoming godless. And he was a little worried that they didn't seem to come to the church to get the church's okay for their power. Now, we know that the church, especially the Roman Catholic Church, which is what the Pope is head of, had a lot of power at one point. Christianity began not like that. Began as a loosey-goosey way of organizing, right? They were persecuted, so they met in caves and catacombs. And then Constantine made Christianity into the official religion of the Roman Empire. And suddenly the church was very wedded to power. In fact, the church became so powerful by the medieval times that the Pope had armies, had lots of wealth and land, and could make and unmake kings. And so by 1925, the power of the church was declining. Secular nationalism was rising. And there was this thing called the Roman question. What should the church do about its declining power, if anything? Should the church try and maintain power, retain power, gather power? What is its relationship to temporal powers? So, because of this changing relationship of the power of the church, Pope Pius XI put in this day, Christ the King Sunday, to ponder the question of how the church should be related in terms of power to temporal powers. Today in 2024, we don't ask the question, should the Archbishop of Canterbury have armies? Even though the Archbishop is still connected to the crown, right? And in the United States, we have different questions. And we have a very clear, at least legally, separation of church and state. So it would be illegal for me to advocate for a particular candidate for election. But that's really the limit, technically, of church and state. The church, it is not illegal for the church to advocate for certain laws and propositions, especially if those laws concern the poor, the vulnerable. The church feels it has a duty to ensure that good laws are there to protect the most vulnerable. In fact, the Episcopal Church has a whole department called Episcopal Policy Network, Episcopal Public Policy Network, EPPN. And this is an arm of advocacy. We go to DC and we walk the halls of Congress and we say this law needs to be in place to protect minimum wage, children, the mentally ill, the homeless. So these issues are gathered at General Convention, the whole body votes on it, and then these concerns are taken to EPPN, and then they work to advocate for the most vulnerable in our society. So that is one way in which our church considers its relationship to temporal power. How we work for a fair, just, and kind society. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have an ambivalent relationship with politics, right? Who gets nervous when there's this, maybe we're going to start talking about politics in the church, right? So today, with this Christ the King Sunday, this sliver of white between green and blue, we are actually asked to think about the questions between the kingdom of God and human kingdoms. So what would be some of the questions one might ask? Here are some that I've thought of. How are we citizens of God's kingdom and citizens of the United States? What does allegiance to God's kingdom mean about our responsibility to the places we live that are ruled by temporal powers? What ought we to do to care for widows and orphans and announce peace on earth and goodwill to all, the values of God's kingdom, when it might go against the interests of temporal powers? How does one work for the salvation of a nation and not just an individual? So we stand at this threshold, this door, and we're walking into this great expectation that is an advent of God's dawning fulfillment of God's kingdom. And we're given today's gospel to contemplate some of these questions. So the scene that we read today in John is preceded by Jesus' arrest. He has really miffed some people. He's been slapped in the face, he's been bound up and taken to Pontius Pilate by his own people. Pontius Pilate is the governor of Judea, set up by Rome. And they want to accuse Jesus of treason. They take him, Jesus, to Pontius Pilate, and they say, he says he's the king. We have no king but Caesar. And Pontius Pilate must have looked at them and said, what are you talking about? That guy? He's that skinny, scrawny guy who hasn't eaten a good meal and wears homespun. Cannot be making such claims. So he must have laughed all the way back to his headquarters to interrogate Jesus, who is bound there. And I imagine Pontius coming into his headquarters and sitting on his judgment seat. And he's like, yeah, so your people, they say you are a king, that you claim to be a king of the Jews. That's funny. But Jesus doesn't answer his question. What have you done? Pilate asked, what have you done to make them think this? Instead, Jesus talks about my kingdom, he says. My kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom, unlike your kingdom, where you have your legions and your armies all at the ready, all standing to obey your commandment at any moment and unleash all the violence. My kingdom is not of this world. Because if my kingdom were like your kingdom, my followers, I'd give them the word, and they would take up the sword, and they would come, and they would try and fight you. So as it is, my kingdom is not of this world. And Pilate doesn't get it. He's like, oh, you say my kingdom? So you do think you're a king. And Jesus says, I have come to testify to the truth. I have not come to do more of what you do. I have come only to testify to the truth. And Pilate answers, what is truth? You know what truth is? Truth is weak. Truth is easy to conquer. All you have to do is just tell a whole bunch of lies. It's like a magnet on a compass. The lies just make it hard for people to figure out what is the truth. Jesus. It's called misinformation. But Jesus says, my followers, they know how to listen to my voice. And when they listen, they know the truth. They can find it out. They can figure it out among all the lies. How does that land for you? Do you feel like you following Jesus helps you know the truth? Helps you discern the truth among the lies? Listening to him. So, you know, Jesus tried really hard to help people listen to him, but not everyone can, because people are addicted to power, easily seduced by the baseness of life. So, this whole thing about kingship was actually from a very earlier point. At the beginning, near the beginning of the Gospel of John, Jesus multiplies the loaves and fishes. And the people ate it. This was supposed to be a sign, right? We talk a lot about the signs in the book of John. A sign points to something. And this multiplication of loaves and fishes was supposed to point to Jesus and who he is and what he was about. He came to point to a particular God who is about grace upon grace, abundant life. And what the people couldn't do was read the sign. They got stuck on the sign itself, like looking at the moon and thinking it is its own source of light. And so they got stuck on the sign, and they were like, well, we just ate a lot of bread. It was good. I haven't been full in years. And they're like, oh, Jesus needs to be our bread factory. Let's make him our bread factory and make him king. If we make him king, we'll always have bread. And Jesus, you're not listening to me. I don't want to be king. And he fled from them, and they're like, let's make him king. We need more bread. And here we are now. He's before Pilate. And they're having this conversation about kingship. And Jesus is telling Pilate, I don't want to be like you. I have come to testify to the truth. I don't want more of you in this world. And so, what does Jesus do? What is his coronation moment? In the Gospel of John, it is very clear. He talks about how he's lifted up, how he will be lifted up on the cross. And when he was crucified, that was his coronation. And above was written, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That was his coronation. It was so different from what Pilate was about. And nobody got it. Everyone thought it was ironic. They walked by and saw that sign, they were like, that's funny. But God was serious. Jesus is crowned king when he was lifted up on the cross. And by his resurrection, he defeated the seduction of death and violence. This week I looked for a cover image for the bulletin. I usually do that. And I Googled Jesus, King of the Jews. And what came up was I found this very strange image. It was of Jesus with a huge red cape, a gleaming sword, a big crown, and he looked like he had just spent a lot of time at the gym. Six-pack, bulging muscles, and a lot of time at the tanning parlor. He looked good, a Fabio Jesus. And then, if you're looking for a sign, this is what we call a counter sign, an anti-sign. It is the opposite of where Jesus was going. It still reveals that for some of us who claim to follow Jesus, that we are still seduced by temporal powers. If you want to know what the king looks like, the Gospel of John tells you the cross. That is the coronation. And so if we want to know the truth, we will pay attention to where that sign is pointing. And when we stand near the cross, It is a needle that cannot be changed by magnets and always be true, pointing to what is true. Amen.